Said, I think I can press on. I remember one time I was chopping cotton. Yes, in Mississippi. I was chopping cotton. Don't feel sorry for me. I'm doing fine now. But I remember one day I got angry. And the man said something to me, and I left. Said, I'm not putting up with this anymore. And I left, started walking away. And an old black woman followed me and said, son, where are you going? I said, I'm going to walk back to town. She said, well, why don't you stay till the evening to get your pay? I said, I can't put up with this man one more moment. And she said, look at me. She said, I put up with a whole lot more than you have. You ought to be able to put up with hell for a day. You ought to be able to put up with hell for a day. Now I stayed until what we call knocking off time. I stayed. But I've been through some things since then that were difficult. And I always tell myself, you ought to be able to put up with hell for a day. You see, when you know what other folks have gone through, when you know what people have gone through, you know, I couldn't imagine children. I used to tell this to students. I can't imagine children sending parents, sometimes single parents, mothers. I couldn't imagine sending my mother or watching my mother go to work in the morning, working at a job that paid minimum wages or a little bit more. I couldn't imagine my mother going off to work and then sending me to school. And I spend my time at the school goofing off and playing. I couldn't imagine seeing what they have done. I can't imagine seeing what other folk have done to get me to this point and I not do anything. The story ought to give you inspiration. I remember going to hear Fannie Lou Hamer speak at Tougaloo College. I had seen her in high school, and I went back to see her at Tougaloo College. This was a woman who was actually a sharecropper, and she had beaten and had been beaten and chased off of her sharecrop. But now she was making speeches trying to get other people to be inspired. And I went to see Fannie Lou Hamer, and she talked to us as college students. Everybody in the audience practically were college students, Jackson State or Tougaloo College. And at the end of her speech, she said to me, now don't you all tell me about how difficult life is for you. And she quoted Langston Hughes. It said, well, son, I'll tell you, life for me ain't been no crystal stair. It's had tacks in it and splinters and boards torn up and places with no carpet on the floor and bare. But all the time, I've been climbing on and reaching landings and turning corners and sometimes going in the dark where there ain't been no light. So, boy, don't you turn back. Don't you sit down on the steps because you find it's kind of hard. Don't you fall now. For I still going, honey. I still climbing. And life for me ain't been no crystal stair. So when young people start talking about how difficult things are, it should tell them the story and say, you don't know what difficulty is. All times are so hard. You haven't seen hard times. You haven't seen hard times. Oh, it's difficult for me. You haven't seen hard times. I've seen black people go and stand in line for hours for boxes of powdered milk and what we used to call commodity cheese, and go home and feed their children and send them to school day in and day out, and they made A's. you haven't seen hard times. If you knew what hard times really were, you would get up and really work. There is power in this story. And we have reared powerless children because we have not told them the story, and we have not used the power of the story to move them to higher heights. I'm always conscious of what other people have gone through to do what I do. When I was in the classroom teaching with all that technology and all the stuff that I could do so easily, I could get angry with my kid and say, I'm going to give you all a test, and have a test read in 15 minutes. And I remember those teachers had to type up stuff, and they put it on something called a stencil, and they put it on this blue stuff, and they run in, the ink was all over their hands. I remember all of that. And when I see what they went through and how easy they have made life for us, there should be nothing too difficult for us to do. The few things that we have to do. Even when it comes to going to church. I saw what people did to go to church. What black people, and you know, I watch folks in their church time. I watch people in their religious lives. Which brings me to the last part of this sermon. You see, the story gives credit to God. The story gives credit to God. You see, when Moses told the people this, he said to them, you are to remind your children of the role that God has played in your deliverance. That it has not been because of you. It is not because you're smart. It's not because you're well organized. It is not because you're politically savvy. It is because of God that you have come this far. By faith. That's what has brought you. Don't think it's your education. That's great. Don't think it is your smartness. That's great. Don't think it is your organization. All of that's great. But Moses wanted them to know that it has been the hand of God that has been over you and watching over. His eyes have been watching over you, and his arms have been caressing you, and that's what has brought you this far. Oh, it would be dangerous. It would be dangerous if you leave that part of the story out in your telling it to your children. Oh, it would be very, very tragic if you would leave that part of the story out in your telling it to your children. Because that's the part of the story that's been the most powerful element of the whole story. And that has been something that has been consistent with black people. Their devotion to God. Their belief that God was in the midst of their movement. Their belief that God was watching over there. Their belief that it was the Lord. That I shall lift up mine eyes toward the hills, from whence cometh my help. My help coming from the Lord. You know, people sometimes tell me, say, you know, I'm surprised about you. What are you surprised about? I'm surprised that all of the changes life has gone through, you're still pretty much the same. I'm surprised that now you lecture at colleges and universities, and colleges use your books as texts, and you still William Jenkins. You're still the same. And I'm surprised at all of that recognition you could have. You don't seem to be excited about that. You're still basically the same. I said, well, You don't seem to be caught up in the change. Well, I am caught up in the change, but not the change you're caught up in. Here's the change I'm caught up in. I'm caught up in the change that I experienced one Wednesday afternoon under a pecan tree in Mississippi, when I prayed to God to change me, to change my heart, to change my soul, to change my life. That's the change. And that change was so thorough. That change was so complete. That change was so powerful that I don't have to get excited about any other changes. This is my story. This is my song. Praising my Jesus all the day long. I know the story. And I know the place that God, or the part that God played in the story. And that's my job, to tell that part that God has played in the story. I will tell the story. I know what God can do through it all. Through it all. God has been. I saw my mother with a 25-pound sack of flour feed all of us all week, and it never ran out. I know what Jesus can do in the story. Now, some people say, well, you know, you're so intelligent now, you ought to experiment with Eastern religions. You ought to experiment with some of the more popular, classy religious philosophy. You ought to do some of that. I'm not interested in anything. I might sound unlike a person with 3 degrees. I might sound unlike an individual who has written 10 books. But I just want everybody to know that I got Jesus. And that's enough. We're going to start acting like the Baptists here. We extend an invitation to discipleship. Is there anybody here who'd like to join the church? Now is a good time.